Yeah, it may be 5 a.m., but I am wide awake because we have some ridiculously cool new legendaries to talk about.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
It's not just legendaries, so if you're short on time, you can hit the quick reviews link in the description below. Otherwise, let's jump into some detailed reviews of these cards. Up first, King PHAORIS, a character we all expected, and we finally get to see him. Neutral legendary, 10 mana, 5/5 battle cry. For each spell in your hand, summon a random minion of the same cost. So we have this enormous board dump style card. Reminds you of things like N'Zoth in the past. They would just summon you a big crazy wide board of stuff. But instead of being a death rattle synergy, this one is essentially a spell synergy, and even more specifically, really a big spell synergy card. You're not going to want a bunch of small minions with a card like King PHAORIS. You're probably looking for a bunch of bigger spells, getting 6, 7, 8 drops, etc. Dumped onto the board can be pretty crazy if your opponent can't manage an answer. Now, obviously, there are ways this will just instantly win you the game if your opponent doesn't resolve it, but it's not always good. It does require some conditions to be met. Namely, you got to have a deck with spells. They need to be at least moderately expensive spells, which means if you're running a lot of those, it could be hard to build the deck with a bunch of like 8-cost spells, for instance. So you either need a range or you just need some minions in there too. So getting, a full board of 6 additional minions, for instance, might not be easy because keeping 6 spells in hand is tough. That like 3 to 4 minion / spell mark might be more realistic for a card like King PHAORIS. 5 might be pretty big high roll. And beyond that, you have to be a deck that is retaining resources in hand, because if you're playing your spells, then they are no longer in your hand. That means that you're either sacrificing tempo or drawing a lot of cards, but you're playing a slower style, certainly, than an aggro deck might. So this is very much a narrowly focused card, right? It's only going to be good in control decks that are running big spells, maybe decks that have battle cry synergy specifically, but I don't think that means that this is a card that has no home. I actually think there are a couple places it could work. We've seen things like the new mage quest that adds a spell to your hand. That could be a deck that generates just a bunch of random spells. We also have a deck like Shaman. Any kind of control shaman, particularly one that's running the Hagatha hero card, can often put a lot of spells into their hand just because you're generating them every time you play a minion. Those sorts of decks can also run Shudderwalk, which would double the value of this battle cry, because you get one from PHAORIS, then you'd get another one from your Shudderwalk. So that seems like a perfect home run fit right off the bat. And I think there are still some other classes and options that could work as well. So we have here a card that has a pretty big payoff when it works, still susceptible to wide board removals, those twisting nethers, those plagues of death. Those are still going to be answers to something like King PHAORIS, but it's still a big time play that's not all that crazy to run in a deck that's built that particular way. So restricted, conditional, but still very, very powerful in a lot of ways. So I do think there will be a deck sooner or later, maybe even sooner, with Control Shaman that is able to utilize PHAORIS really, really successfully. So maybe not a standout all-star meta-defining card, but nonetheless a strong one that will see some play in a good deck. So now let's talk about Siamat. 7 mana, 6/6 elemental, also a neutral legendary minion. Battle cry, gain 2 of Rush, Taunt, Divine Shield, or Wind Fury, your choice. So a little bit of awkward wording here, but essentially you get to pick 2 of those keywords. You can go Taunt and Rush. You can go Divine Shield and Wind Fury. You can go Rush and Wind Fury, or maybe the most important, I think, is you can go Divine Shield and Rush. And what that means is you have this mid-rangey minion at 7 mana that can do some pretty interesting things on the board. For instance, if you go Divine Shield and Rush, you get to take a free trade into a minion on board, most of the time killing something pretty valuable and retaining a 6/6, which reminds me of things like, say, a Firelands Portal that always gives you a good minion, even a card like Blaze Caller, which has been played a little bit, but in this case does even more damage to minions. Now this can't go face, but in most cases those were being used to trade into stuff for big swings on board, and Siamat can do that. Like, that's a possibility for this card, but you also have options like Rush and Wind Fury. which means that you can trade into two smaller things instead of maybe like one big thing for a raw value trade. So you can help chip away at, if you need to just kill 2 4/4s, you can. If you can keep your Siamat alive in the meantime, then that's great too. Killing a 2/3 and a 2/3 would be perfect for a card like this to take some value trades, enabling it to go 3 for 1 in that particular scenario. And then if your opponent doesn't have anything for you to react to at all, maybe Rush isn't worth it, and you just drop a big scary threat with Divine Shield and Taunt, just something that's really difficult for them to deal with. Or even Divine Shield and Wind Fury if you think they just don't have an answer and you're going to get to attack phase for 12. So all kinds of different combinations here. And the great part about a card like this is that you get to dictate what you're going to do based on the scenarios. That flexibility makes it much more favorable for so many different kinds of board states. That means it's never going to feel like an absolute just fail of a play. If you're behind, you've got recovery and swing tools. If you're ahead, you can create a card that offers a lot of pressure. If you're desperate for a taunt, you got an option too. So this looks like an absolutely great play most of the time for 7 mana. Now, the question for this card will be whether or not decks will want to run it. And I think the answer to that's pretty simple. Yeah, I think they absolutely will. Control decks could use a card like this. Maybe not like raw aggro decks. You'd probably be looking for more immediate damage output, but any kind of mid-range deck that likes these sorts of threats, Siamat's a great fit for that as well. So it's not a universal card like Ziliax, perhaps, which I've seen some people comparing it to, but I do think it's one of those wider use legendaries that a handful of different decks and certainly different classes are going to be able to utilize. So it's going to see a significant amount of play and be something we're accustomed to in the future Saviors of Uldum meta. So now let's take a look at the Wrapped Golem, a 7 mana, 7/5 neutral minion with Reborn. And at the end of your turn, summon a 1/1 Scarab with Taunt. So this is very similar to a card from the past, Obsidian Destroyer for Warrior, that was a 7/7 that summoned a 1/1 Scarab. A card that did not see much play. It turns out in Constructed, those 1/1s just don't really go far enough, and there are better plays to be made. I think back in those days, maybe things like Dr. Boom, for instance. And I think Wrapped Golem is going to face a lot of the same fate here. Unfortunately, 5 health for 7 drop, not that exciting. Even with Reborn, when it comes back, that's 6 total health points to deal with, and although they're split and might require multiple instances of resources, maybe allowing Wrapped Golem to go like 2 for 1, for instance, it's still just not enough for a 7 drop in my mind to give it that survivability. And even if it does summon a 1/1 Scarab as well, that's still only a total of 7 health bundled across all this different stuff, and each of it's pretty easy to deal with, and nothing like snowballs crazily out of control, because it is just 1/1 per turn. So there's a pretty limited scale on this card. It's not going to go absolutely nuts if it stays around for a few turns. In Constructed, that is. Maybe in Arena, this could be pretty scary, because 1/1s can be a lot more disruptive, and these trades would be more meaningful. But in Standard format, at this point in the game, when you're trying to spend 7 mana, you're trying to do big, crazy things. You're trying to either stay alive in some cases or make, aggressive moves towards an in-game state where you're winning, you're enabling combos, you're setting up finishers, you're trying to do more than Wrapped Golem can provide. And there are so many other cards that do far more for similar costs. So to me, this one just looks kind of slow, kind of passive, pretty easy to deal with, and despite some potential Reborn synergies and some really, really slow token stuff, I just don't think this card gets there. This one's going to fall pretty far short. So moving on to the Cartot Defender, a 6 mana 3/4 neutral minion with Taunt, Reborn, and Death Rattle. Restore 3 health to your hero. So because of this Reborn and Death Rattle combination, this card's pretty interesting. It comes back as a 3/1 Cartot Defender that will still have that Death Rattle, so in total, this minion would heal you for 6. It would also have Taunt on both portions, so it would be a 2-part Taunt. So theoretically, a very effective defensively minded minion here that just heals you, it gets in your opponent's way, and that's pretty cool. Now, that said, I don't know if this is going to be good enough to make the cut for the average deck. I think compared to other mid to late game minions, there are just better options. Would you rather run Safeguard, for instance, just because it's more total defensive stats on board and it takes better trades with its top half? That's a possibility. If you compare it to something at the 5 mana slot like Rotten Apple Bomb, I think Apple Bomb offers a lot of the same utility. It's a heal and it's a taunt, and although it's not a 2-part taunt, it's a little bit cheaper, so it might just be more effective in other decks, even if they're trying to utilize Death Rattle synergies as well. So Cartot Defender is certainly fine looking, and I'm not saying he won't be the magic card that lines up for some deck, because maybe they don't need a 5-drop. Maybe the Reborn aspect has a synergy here or there, and yeah, absolutely. It kind of feels like a Sludge Belcher that's a little bit more expensive, but also has more healing upside as well. So I do envision this as a possible play for some decks out there, particularly if they're looking to utilize Reborn specifically as a mechanic. This just might be one of the necessary Reborn minions for something like, say, a Quest Paladin if there's not enough Reborn cards. Otherwise, you might just have to include this in a list. But even beyond that, it's certainly a fine minion. It's going to be cool to get out of random generation effects. It is disruptive to your opponent. It would be much more exciting if that second half minion didn't only have 1 health, as we've talked about before with some previous Taunt Reborn cards. That does limit these a little bit for their utility, I think, but nonetheless, a totally fine card. So moving on here, we have the Wretched Reclaimer for Priest, a new 3-mana 3/3 minion with a battle cry: destroy a friendly minion, then return it to life with full health. So essentially a reincarnate style effect, but on a body here, and a fairly nice body is a 3/3 for 3. That feels good. This also reminds me a little bit of a card like Terror Scale Stalker. That one's specific to Death Rattles and activating a Death Rattle, but certainly if you play your Wretched Reclaimer on a Death Rattle minion, it's going to feel exactly like a Terror Scale Stalker, where you kill it, you reap the benefit of killing it because you activate its Death Rattle, and then you return it to life anyway. Terror Scale Stalker leaves it there, but you end up with essentially the same result. So this feels like a Terror Scale Stalker comparable immediately, and that was a great card. Obviously a card that saw a ton of play in Death Rattle Hunter, and Priest has Death Rattle synergies like crazy, and Reborn synergies as well now. So that alone makes this card look interesting. But then you have some other applications as well, where you can just use this as a heal of sorts, where you trade in a big minion. Priest runs a lot of high health stuff, and then if it takes too much damage, you can just say, okay, look, maybe I don't have any Death Rattles right now to activate with my Wretched Reclaimer, but I want to play a 3/3, and you know what, I can just resummon this minion with some additional health, or maybe bring a Divine Shield back to life. So outside of even Death Rattle synergies, it would seem like the obvious choice for a card like this, it still does some pretty positive things. So absolutely, this looks like a playable card to me. It works in a couple different directions. The stat lines make sense. It's flexible enough at its mana cost that you can slot it into turns while doing other things, so it's not like it's demanding all of your mana or attention in a given scenario. So it feels like a really flexible addition to the class that synergizes with their plans and feels good from an efficiency standpoint. Moving on to the Sahket Mercenary, a new 4-mana 4/4 pirate for Rogue. Death Rattle, return a random enemy minion to your opponent's hand. So that is essentially a random sap that is on the Death Rattle for this minion. And theoretically, sap's a great card. Returning stuff to your opponent's hand is an awesome tempo play because they have to respend that mana. They lose the stats on board. They lose initiative. So when this works well, that's a really high upside. You know, you can take your opponent's giant threat, turn that mountain giant back into their hand so they have to replay it. That would be a great result. Unfortunately for a card like Sahket Mercenary, it has some pretty big challenges to overcome. Number one, it's a random enemy minion. So often it's going to backfire. It's not going to hit the thing you want if your opponent can play small stuff. Beyond that, often because you're playing it out, usually your opponent is going to dictate when and how it dies. So they have a little bit more control over whether or not this thing is going to hit a key minion. And even if they do have a big thing and only a big thing, they can still just trade it into this to get a little bit of value. So even when this is doing the thing it's supposed to do against maybe a singular minion, your opponent might just be able to negate the effect entirely by taking an equal trade, or just take a value trade that allows them to replay that minion with additional health. So there are some scenarios where this actually backfires and doesn't feel all that good at all, especially because you're giving your opponent so much control over resolving this effect. So in theory, a pretty cool card. It's also got some Death Rattle synergies, which are something we're seeing for Rogue, so that's worth keeping an eye on. And I do like the idea of Rogue managing the board a little bit, and if you can play this out ahead of your opponent and you can dictate how it trades, then it's certainly a card that's got more possibility. So if a fast Death Rattle Rogue exists, this is kind of cool. Or maybe if it's just really cheap because of a card like Sahket, you could play it and try to get a little extra value out of it because you're happy to get a 1 mana bonus death rattle effect. Essentially, all of those are absolutely possibilities for a card like this, but more than likely, I think its awkwardness and its lack of control and influence are going to leave it just a little shy. There are going to be better options at the 4 mana slot. Probably even better death rattle minions will be available as well. So the Sahket mercenary will unfortunately fall short to me. So finally here we have the Flame Ward, a new secret for Mage, of course 3 mana spell. Secret reads, after a minion attacks your hero, deal 3 damage to all enemy minions. So your first take on this might be, oh, it's like a better explosive trap. And in some ways it certainly is, because it's dealing 3 damage to minions as opposed to 2. That feels really good. I think that's a meaningful break point. A lot of things have 3 health these days in Hearthstone. So that's very nice. But there are some key differences between this card and Explosive Trap that are worth noting. First off, it does not hit the opposing hero, so there's no additional damage. I don't really think that's much of a downside. That's great for a class like Hunter Mage. Probably wouldn't be as concerned about getting a few points of chip damage against the opposing class, because we're not seeing as much like raw burn mage these days. Now that has been successful in the past, so something to keep an eye on. That might be the downfall of this card eventually if a more aggro-y mage comes out. But also noteworthy for this card is that it does not kill the minion that is doing the attacking. Explosive Trap happens whenever a minion attacks. This is after a minion attacks. So in some cases, your opponent might still be able to get that extra damage through that's meaningful, that sets up a lethal that maybe just kills you outright. So it's not quite as good at protecting yourself, but a little bit better at clearing the board, because that minion will still die. It's all enemy minions, not the ones that didn't attack you in that particular scenario. Also noteworthy is this does not trigger off of a face attack. It's only after a minion attack. So, you know, a weapon attack with Explosive Trap will activate. This will not. So a little bit easier in some ways for your opponent to perhaps deny some value on this one, or just avoid triggering it in some cases while still pumping out damage. So some upsides and some downsides. But ultimately, I think just because it is an efficient way to deal with some early game boards, addressing zoo-style plays, addressing things like Murlocs in some cases, this does give Mage an interesting extra tool in their arsenal. I don't think this actually gets run today in a constructed deck. It's going to only be something you're excited to see off of like Mana Cyclones occasionally and those random generation effects as we understand Mage today. But we have seen some additional secret synergy stuff come along. If that deck doesn't make the cut now, I certainly think it's something to keep an eye on moving forward. So I don't expect this card to be constructed ready immediately, but I do think at some point this will be a card that makes a cut in a constructed deck and feels pretty good to play. All that said, let's now jump into some quick reviews. King PHAORIS is a 4-star card. Siamat is a 5-star card. Wrapped Golem is a 2-star card. Cartot Defender is a 3-star card. Wretched Reclaimer is a 4-star card. Sahket Mercenary is a 2-star card. Flame Ward is a 4-star card. And there you go, guys. Some pretty crazy legendaries. PHAORIS looks like so much fun. Super excited to play that. Siamat just looks like a good card. I think we're going to see a lot of him. Seems like a good, fine design too. A little confusing on the wording, but I'm happy to see a card like that existing. But I'm curious what you guys think. Do you like these? Did I rate them wrong? Did I rate them right? Share your thoughts in the comments below as always. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.